Welcome to Circling Dialogos and my conversation with Christopher. This is an extraordinary conversation, I thought, where it's actually a continuation of a conversation that was started between Chris and I. And a little bit of the background is Chris is currently taking the art of circling, which is a year-long practitioner training in how to facilitate circling, which is, for those of you who are not familiar, circling is like a intersubjective yoga or intersubjective meditation, generally like in a group process. And exploring the idea that what we're doing in circling is a kind of enactment of person making. And we explore that in detail in this conversation, which I'm sure is going to be the first of many along these lines, about what is a person, how does a person become a person, what's going on in circling that highlights dynamics that go on all the time with people and relationships. And I think what we're finding, and I keep kind of rediscover through this conversation, is just how deeply being a person only makes sense in the context of intersubjectivity in relationship. And that's the way we start off when we're infants, and that we continually can develop through them, through our whole lives. And that circling is a kind of ritual, if you will, that provide the right constraints that highlight things like agape and processes of moving from, let's say, persona to person. So I hope you really enjoy this conversation. I certainly did, and I hope to see you back. Thank you for watching. Also, if you are interested in exploring circling, the links are below. We have open events, we have weekend events, we have the year-long training, and I also do one-on-one work with people. So if you're interested in coaching with me, email me, and I'll get back with you, and we'll set up an exploratory session where we cover the cost and we see if it's a good fit and all that stuff. And my email is in the show notes below, along with all the other links. Enjoy.
Okay. In the same way that, when we start a dialogos, when we do start a dialectic in dialogos anyway, it's like we pick a virtue, right? Mm-hmm. And we know, because we've talked about this at length now, that what we're doing is we're circling virtue itself always. It doesn't matter what virtue we pick. Mm-hmm. We're circling virtue itself, right? The particular virtue chosen is just an aspectualization of our relationship to virtue itself. It's one form of relating to virtue itself, mm-hmm. A part relating to the whole. Using a part to presence the whole, which is what makes the whole thing properly symbolic, right? When part presences whole, as opposed to mistaking itself for whole. And that's the brilliant Schindler, I think. That's the following the logos as opposed to the miss all logos, right? Which is that the missologos, the missology, is the part is misapprehended as being the totality, as opposed to something that participates in a totality and extends from it, processes from it, returns to it. And so each virtue that we circle in dialogos is a way of relating to the whole by one of its parts, or by one of its forms of relating, let's say, something like that. Mm-hmm. And then to take circling, it seems to me that, kind of what you just said is that is that the individual person being circled is just analogous to the individual virtue, insofar as every instance of circling that person is circling person.
Yeah.
And that person is coming into relation with personhood, with their personhood, with their relationship with personhood.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Their relation as a part. It's like trying to like the way I see it is, in my kind of way, we're trying to symbolize the person, right?
Yeah.
We're trying to make out of that person a symbolic, transparent through line that gives us access to person itself.
Yeah.
To come into relation to the eidos of everything that we all are and to participate in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And that's why it's like so liturgical. Like this whole process just seems to me to be so rife with a kind of liturgy.
Yeah.
It's like, right.
Yeah.
And
in the way that you're using liturgy here is a bit what
there's like a formal process of putting a certain number of words in a certain kind of order.
Yeah.
And having a certain formality of, this is how we begin.
Mm-hmm.
This is how we prepare the ritual.
Yeah.
This is how we use a few propositions to kind of cordon off the arena.
Yeah.
And those propositions, those sort of we're staking the ground in which we're going to play, and establishing the boundaries of the ground is actually what's going to allow that ground to become sacred.
Yeah.
Right. We're basically transforming the place. We're creating place. Right. Yeah. I think of liturgy as doing that. Right. Liturgy is sort of like a linguistic way of creating place for symbol making.
Right. Right. Yeah, makes sense.
Right. And so then you have these people who are so, and I see circling as very much like the way I imagine it imaginally, let's say, as I imagine someone is in the center and there's a circle of people around them. Mm-hmm. And that circle of people creates a kind of container into which a person can extend their relationship with self.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So the way I kind of see it is that we go into a circle at the beginning. I'm speaking, of course, still from within my relatively limited experience, but I think I've got enough of it now to get a sense of what's going on, which is that I come in as an ego, very much as an ego, right? Mm-hmm. And this goes to what you were saying earlier about this person who said, like, I come in and I'm all, right?
Yeah.
And I think what happens is that I think that one way of understanding what's going on, and like if we were to put it in Jungian language for a second, it's like that the circle is there to help give shape to the ego self axis, right?
Yeah.
To allow the ego to gain access to herself.
Yeah.
And that circle, all of those people and the one leading it are basically there to help reflect, to follow the logos of person along that axis, to find it, to carry the lanterns in and help to find the axis where it lies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Allow the person to walk the causeway of that axis, to stand in it, to stand in their relation to themselves consciously. And that person, so one of the ways, like, to begin to think about, like, what do we mean by person?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Rather than thinking of person as a thing, mm-hmm. I'm thinking of person, at least provisionally, as a name given to that relation, as a name given to the relation between ego and self.
Yeah.
And that if that circling is the dialogos of person, it is trying to give voice and form to the invisible pattern that is the relating between the ego and the totality.
Yeah.
The totality of what we are in potentia, which
Right.
is self.
And
And
thing is like this, like the circle, the ritual of the circle is a symbol of,
yeah,
right, of like a concentrated version, an enactment of that, of this relationship between person and totality, right?
yeah.
Or right, the ego and self relation, right?
Yes.
And it were so the propositions are the, in some sense, like the container of that world, right, that symbolize that world and enacts person making, right,
Yeah.
in some
Yeah.
way.
Right. And then person making, it's like person making is relationship making.
Yeah.
Like if we think person, I feel like there is no way of saying person without saying being a person, because person isn't, it's like what we often have to do in these exercises is shift away from thingness,
Yeah.
from being trapped in the thingness way of thinking.
Yeah.
Right. So then person, I think, is person is the act of relating. It's not any given thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You ever find yourself like I find myself, and I use this expression without really knowing what I mean by it, and I hear other people saying it, like after COVID, after we were able to kind of like come back in the world a little bit more and socialize and engage and find ourselves drawn out by the world a little bit more, I found myself saying like, oh, I can be a person again.
Right.
And I hear other people saying, oh, I can be a person again. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And I think something like what it means is that person is that name that we give to the enactment of the relationship between myself as a part and myself as participating in the whole, in the through line, finding myself standing in the current of that through line.
Yeah.
Where there is a possibility of myself that is beyond the egoic confines. And when I stand in the possibility of anything occurring to me that is me, but that is not the me that I have contained in my grasp, I find myself being a person.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I'm participating, I am now in relationship with person, capital P, person.
Yeah.
I'm in, which is just another way of saying that ego has a proper respiration with self.
Yeah.
And maybe they're just different ways of conceptualizing the same overall thing, right? Which is that this sense of being partial, this sense of being confined, when it enters into relationship with the very ground that seeds it being and life and existence, when it grounds out in what's most real about it, it becomes continuous. Like I dissolve. It's like what John talks about, the flow state, right? It's like I dissolve into the ground of what makes me exactly the same person.
Right.
And so it's like, I don't know if we can talk about, like, being a person is an act. It's not a thing to be, right?
Exactly.
It's a way of being ourselves. Or something like that. And then circling allows when it's functioning to its potential, allows me to come into the current of personhood. It allows me to be a person. When the being of a person is being in relation to the totality of that in virtue of which we all are as we are.
Right. And there's something about, it seems like that there's something about this, like, well, one of the things I'm thinking about is the notion of character, right? And maybe this starts to get at some of the differences of between something like idle talk, right? Like identity preserving conversations, right? And ones that are ones that are by nature developmental of character, right?
Yeah.
So in some sense, I think that's one of the things that's interesting is this is, you know, I've often said that this is kind of like circling is something like if you took all the deep conversations that ever happened and you like took out the basic components or postures, right? Like asanas that underlie those conversations, right? And you just, we got together and assumed those postures. That's basically what we're doing with circling.
Right.
And it's something like there's a certain kind of the constraints in circling seem to afford, I mean, walking through a lot of anxiety, right? Self-disclosure, tolerating a lot of anxiety, right? Kind of confronting otherness, right? Being seen, all of these things that are like inherently are uncomfortable, but can also be character forming, right? Yeah. Versus something like character confirmation or confirming, right? I think that there's something going on with what makes it a genuine, it's a genuine inquiry, right?
Right.
But there's something about the process that seems to already have in its view that I am more than I understand.
Right.
Right. Something ironic about it, right? Like that, in that way that Kierkegaard really kind of like tunes into, right? That way that is, I'm this strange, peculiar, myself is myself in that I'm that which I am becoming.
Yes.
Right? To be the self is to be the one of who I am is to be the one I am becoming. Yes. Right.
Yes.
So it's right. Like there's this contradiction in there. And,
yes.
And there's something about, I think, in circling that starts to play on that in a very explicit way.
Right.
Right. Such that, you know, and so much of person, as we just kind of like read through a little bit about, like the etymology really has a lot to do with them. There's like lots of things about persona, about a mask, right? To sound through it, something we sound through.
Yeah.
And a persona only makes sense in relation, right?
Yeah.
So a character develops, right, through the story, right, over time. That character develops somehow over time.
Right.
And so my sense of person is this: it's a community event, right, in a real deep way, right?
Because you always say that with circling, what you're doing is being with what is, right?
Yeah.
And then, and so we take a character in a story. The moments of the story that are most defining for the character are those moments where the character is revealed, that the nature of the character, that the entire function of the story is to reveal the character, is to disclose the character, right? And there's a way in which, like, especially with like canonical stories, right? Stories that have like been hailed as classics, all of the things that happen, like the plot, is only relevant as an extension of the sum of consequences of being that character, right? That the world and the character are indistinguishable, and that the world is in a kind of dialogue with the character, because the world is a function of the character's dialogue with themselves. And those moments in canonical stories that are most defining and even sacred are those moments in which the world is revealed as an extended function of the revelation of that character. And the final revelation of that character is also the whole telos of the story, right?
Right.
The story is only valuable insofar as it is the revelation of character with what is, and the character becomes who he is by becoming different, by becoming other than the persona.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the character moves from persona, the masked, to being unmasked.
Yeah.
And the movement from persona to person is a kind of final revelation of coming into person, coming into relation with person.
Yeah.
And then in circling, it seems to me that, like, basically the people gathered in the circle around the individual being circled are basically creating the world. It's not the same narrative form, which is interesting, although it can be, right? It's like it's trying to me, it seems like it's trying to somehow play on both axes, the vertical and the horizontal, right? Whether it's the phenomenological circle or the more narrative topical circle.
Yeah.
And so what's happening is something like people are gathering and agreeing to create the container of the world that is analogous to the world of the character in the story.
Yeah.
And the world provides the opportunity to draw out the disclosure and help move the individual from persona into person, where person is an expression of the unconcealment.
Yeah, totally.
Right.
Interesting. To move the person, right? Move the person from persona to person, from persona to person. That movement seems, you're right.
Yeah.
It's that movement that in some sense the whole thing kind of organizes around. It's those movement, and it's those moments where that happens that are so it's part of the renewing.
Yes.
That happens. The receiving.
Right.
Because it is interesting, because there is that quality of where and this is one of the things is like the more difficulty and things that people can develop into doing better and better, but it's really hard, which is it's really easy to be, if we say there's the person being circled, and if the people are like the world, right? That to be, in some sense, is to be in that world, is to be that world, but then to realize, like, as the people in that world, to realize their part, that they're already participating in such a way that they're in response, right, to the person or the persona, right? And that they've been enacting it. And then people realize, like, oh, I have been playing this role, right?
Yes.
With you. And so there's this kind of meta perspective on that role, and you see it. And oftentimes those are these really dramatic insights that people have about.
Right. And that's kind of aporia, right? There's like a moment of aporia that occurs there, like the aporia and the dialogos, where I realize that I've been speaking forth the virtue that is not the virtue.
Yeah.
Right. So in the circle, it's like I've been speaking of myself.
Yeah.
But I've been speaking of persona the entire time.
Totally.
And waking up to that is like, right?
Yeah.
I'm stuck in a world, and I can't. Someone help me get out of it. Like, I don't know how to not live inside persona. I don't know how not to live inside of the conception of this virtue that relates to an invisible belief that I can't find my way out of. And it's the same thing, right?
Right.
And it's the same thing on so many different levels, because the belief about a virtue, the belief that conditions our relation to a virtue is precisely part of what defines our personhood, right?
Yeah.
Which is why circling
again, the belief that what?
The belief about a virtue that is our way of relating to that virtue cannot ultimately be separated from our personhood.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because our way of relating, right, to self, which is, if we take that as a provisional idea of what person is, is mediated through our contact with virtue, right? And so if like my contact with virtue is constitutive of person, it's constitutive of my relation to self. And so if I'm living within a persona of virtue, it's the same thing as living within a persona that is an abbreviated idea of myself.
Right. Totally. Totally. Yeah.
Right?
And then it's like when you hit that impasse of basically like, so I'm, in some sense, here I am being circled and I am thrown, like I kind of project my way of indexing the world, right? And then everyone starts to, in some sense, assume the character, the corollary character, right, that keeps my character in play, right? And then people start to, and then everyone else starts to be authentic about what it's like being with you.
Yeah.
And it's in those moments where the other characters, right, kind of what is it in some sense, don't play along.
Yeah.
In that way. And when we were talking about, oh fuck, I'm trapped in this formation of this world and acting out this thing, I can't get out of it, right? And in some sense, there's two things going on there. Like on one level, like I really want to be free of that, right? Because of all the different reasons, right? Because it's confining, it's like not totally authentic or whatever's going on. But on another level, I'm terrified. There's a vulnerability there.
Yeah.
That when the other characters don't assume their role, right?
Yes.
That's the opportunity, right? Yeah. For persona to move into person.
Right.
And it's that vulnerability that I think when other people feeling that, I think it's almost impossible to not, there's something that goes on with that where when I experience your vulnerability, right? And I see people being gracious in the presence of that and welcoming of that and accepting of that, right? And compassionate with that. There's something about where it's almost like being with you, being vulnerable. It's as if I'm doing that. Like you're in some sense doing something that is innately, you're doing it in some sense for me as well. Right?
Yes, it's happening. It's happening to me as it's happening to you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. And as long as it's a consequence of the attention, the listening, as you eloquently speak about it, as long as it's a consequence of my paying deep attention to you, it's only in that it occurs for me.
Yeah.
And I wonder sometimes I wonder, and perhaps the danger would be that sometimes people could lapse back into persona in the movement to person and simulate the movement to person from within persona.
Yeah.
So if being right, I could be being with you and simulate, and maybe very credulously, like not in an attempt to be duplicitous or deceptive, but I could be simulating it by projecting it onto you.
Yeah.
Because I've seen both happen in the limited number of circles I've been in. I've seen both, right? Which is, I've seen something very authentic that people are, and myself too, affected by in virtue of the attention paid to the making vulnerable of the relation to person.
Yeah.
And then it's like a shining, like an effort, like a kind of a diffusion of light through everyone, right?
Yeah.
But then I've also seen
Yeah.
it happen with a reverse orientation where
Right.
I, who am, let's say, circling you or participating in circling you, am projecting. It's like I'm projecting it to you rather than manifesting it in mimetically because of my attention being trained on the unfolding of you.
Mm-hmm.
I am projecting the event onto you and simulating the ecstasis.
Yeah.
But still within persona, without even knowing the difference. Sometimes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I'm struggling to get that out, but do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally do. I totally do. Where it's like, people, for example, someone's, enacting, they're play acting authenticity.
Yeah.
And there's a subtle, but what they're really doing is in some sense surviving, right? In that moment. Like,
right.
Surviving in that moment, right? Yeah.
Right. Because they're playing a role. You got exactly. They're playing a role. They're performing dutifully and well-intentioned. They're performing their function as expected or as they have anticipated it.
Yes.
And it's so telling the difference between those two things can be very difficult, but you just sort of feel it, right? You just feel, right? And it's sort of, so going back to sort of the story analogy, it's like that's the moment when the other characters in your story become characters, become more than just functionaries, become just features of the world. But that's become thou, and that's when therefore the world becomes thou. Therefore that's when it can reciprocally open with you in dialogue, because then the moment where someone goes from being a functionary of the expected role to disposing a receptivity to what is occurring to you is the moment that they become thou. And then the entire world becomes coextensive with self and its unfolding, rather than being coextensive with ego and persona. It's like it breaks the world open suddenly. Right?
Totally. And in those moments of where, and this is the challenge, right? This is like, and that it can fail and that there's that danger of it failing, right? Seems important, right? And exemplar of the phenomena itself. So in those moments where somebody's kind of, we'll call it the false glow. Right?
I like that.
And when the other characters, they stop being personas, right? When they're honest about that, which is very difficult to do, right? And that's why it's a mutual vulnerability, right? Like, because it's really true. It's like there is a sense where people have, people's identities, people can get so identified with being a particular way, or being nice, or being helpful, never hurting anybody, or all these kinds of things.
I get that. I get that for sure. From within. Yeah. It's remarkably hard to dislodge oneself from that.
Totally. And so when somebody's enacting that, and the other person continues just to stay with what their experience of it is, which is like, this doesn't feel like this is 100%, right? This doesn't feel real.
Yeah.
There's a leaning in of where in some sense the characters of the world, right? That's one of the reasons why there's like so much benefit, right, of just participating in the circle without just being the person who's being circled, right? Just participating in the circle, because participating because what that requires for that to be able to become possible is for the other person to be authentic, right? and sit through that experience of like, right, of whatever will erupt, right, in that, right? But
right. So, okay, so for that to happen, that's okay. So this is good. So for that to happen, like if I'm participating in a circle and whether leading it or supporting it, what I have to do in some sense, there's almost like there's a certain kind of kenosis that's required. It's like I have to, like you often say, in order to listen, you have to kind of empty yourself, right? And that's a remarkably difficult thing to do, because that's an absolute act of vulnerability, that emptying, that being receptive, because we don't like, it's so hard to realize just how difficult that actually is.
Right.
But you know when it's happening. And maybe this goes back to the ritualization, the ritual or liturgical aspects, because I mean, I think John's right, that there's a reason that John's Neoplatonic contemplation is one of the preceding practices. Although I wonder sometimes whether it almost has to be like basically like enfolded much more directly, because the ritual of that self-emptying is necessary in order to precondition or enable vulnerability required to be with somebody in that way, and not be contriving. And like this is a mea culpa, as much as like I find myself doing that. It's right. It's like I'm formulating all kinds of things, and it's like, shut up, listen, just be here. But it's like you can't help it, right? You start formulating all of these kind of advanced projective ideas because of persona. That's what persona is calling out of you. It's calling you to reinforce a structure of interacting, and that structure of interacting has a certain amount of relationship to virtue. If it didn't, then it would be absolutely evil. But it's just not the right kind of relationship. So it's like we need this ritual way to empty of all of the persona content that would prefigure, anticipate, project, basically be the advanced party into the mission.
Yeah, totally.
And
totally.
It's so difficult to do that. I'm just like, I'm sitting with that difficulty right now, and just feeling it, talking about it, just feeling how difficult that is.
Yeah. Right? And that difficulty is, I think, that's the development. It is that difficulty, right? That is the developmental aspect of it, that you can develop. You're developing like these deep capacities of being, right? With that. So it's kind of like one of it was Adi Shanti, actually. I think I heard this, and I thought there's something about what he said here that just, in some sense, epitomizes you could say, that capacity, right? Where he was saying, he was talking about, and Adi Shanti is like a spiritual teacher. And he was talking about his experience of teaching and working with people, right? So he kind of talks. I guess the thing is like he kind of talks. He does sangha, and then students come up and sit with him, and then ask questions, and they interact. And he says over time, what he does when he teaches, right, is that whoever it is that comes up, he just finds and contacts the person across from him that's already awake. And he says what he does is like, no matter whatever the person is saying, right, whatever questions that he has, is all he does is he just recognizes the one in you that's already awake. And he just addresses the recognition of that which is already awake, whether or not you realize it or not, right?
The one you just, I don't know if you did that intentionally, but the way you put that is you said he recognizes the one in you.
Yep. The one in you that's already awake. Yes.
The one in you. There we go.
And it's funny because you can feel it. It's like, because he knows that one, right, in himself, right, affords that kind of listening of you.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, and I think that's the right there. That's the spiritual, you could say, development, that the why, that the thing we're developing in circling, or one of the main things that we're developing in circling, is that kind of listening that one can only do with their own being, right? Their whole being.
Yeah. It's like what Heraclitus in his fragments about the hidden unity finds, the hidden unity, right? Between, right, I and thou.
Yeah.
The axis of I and thou is the hidden unity.
Yeah.
That is the logos, right? Yeah. And that finding the one in you that knows the one in me.
Yeah.
Is that which binds us and makes ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Because one of the things that I feel like is going on in circling is that Heraclitean paradox that in order to be myself, in order to become myself, I must become other than myself, right? Mm-hmm. Like I stay the same by changing. I remain myself.
Yeah.
By
yeah. Yeah.
And that's why we find ourselves in these moments much more ourselves, precisely by relinquishing ourselves to the presence of what will be when we dispose ourselves to listen.
And
it's such an act of faith, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's such an act of faith. It's so hard, but it's such an act of faith to just surrender yourself to yourself.
Yeah.
And maybe being a person is the act of that surrendering.
Yeah.
That circle, for which circling is the symbolic container, right?
Right.
Totally. A container into which to surrender, a kind of gateway through which to surrender to yourself in the care of thou, when others truly become thou.
Totally. And sometimes, wouldn't you say that this is the love that affords that way of seeing, right? I think would be agape, wouldn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Which is interesting, because agape is that which makes persons.
Yep. Yeah.
And it's interesting. There is this. We've been doing a few dialogoses now on agape, and one of the things that's been striking to me about it, there's one of the mysteries there is, and I think you're pointing to it with Heraclitus and this kind of contradiction, right? That it's strange, because agape is the utter, right, unconditional, spontaneous love, right? It's like, it's just simply that you exist, I love you.
Yes.
Right? It's a spontaneous, there's no condition of that love, right? In that sense. And so in that sense, it's like, it's radically universal, right? Yet somehow that universality makes personal. It's just an interesting thing about, like, the way John talks about that in his lecture on agape, right? Seems like, one of the things that Christianity did is, and one of the main reasons it spread, right, was this opportunity where Christ was like, no, like, everyone can become person through this love, right?
Yeah.
And before that, it was like, it was all these conditions and, aristocrats and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yep. Hierarchies and whatnot. Yes.
and
yes,
power, right? And so that's interesting. So I think that's one of the things that, if we think about this sense of circling is in some way a revealing or an adducing of the through line of that person, right? To come into relation with that through line, right?
Yeah.
In this certain sense, calls forth the through line of myself, right? Like, if the through line of myself is underdeveloped or unknown or right,
right,
is to the degree that I'm not going to be able to really confront thou, right? The I thou, right? So the I, right? If this I is underdeveloped, it can't quite rise to meet that, right? But as it does, right? Because what it takes to do that, right, is in some sense like to be able to, in that moment where that like this person is kind of maybe feigning the glow, doesn't quite know it, right? But you can feel it. And it'd be a lot easier just to kind of go along with that. But instead, right, you're authentic about what it's like for you, right? And you just kind of share your own experience. You lean into that interaction. Here's the question. What do I understand that affords me to make that choice in that moment with that person, right? Like, where it would be in some sense easier to go along with it, but instead I kind of confront the matter, right? And open that up and risk all the things that may happen, right? What is it that I understand, right, that affords me to take that risk, which I think is the developmental process, right? It's through that risk.
Repeated. As the circlee, for instance?
As a circler.
As the circler, right. Yeah.
Which invites the circlee to share the risk with you, right?
Yeah. Boy, that's a good question. That's a good question.
It seems like there's a pre-understanding of the possibility of personhood, I think.
Yes.
Right.
And yes. And maybe that kind of goes hand in hand with a kind of Socratic dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
That comes with knowing that one is caught inside of an appearance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Caught inside the persona.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe they go together.
Right.
Right. The anticipation of the possibility of personhood and the dissatisfaction with being ultimately kind of contained within persona.
Yeah.
Except that same tension can resolve in a kind of impasse, right? Too. Like that I think that's part of what gives people the greatest amount of despair, that impasse, which is, I can't be with myself.
Yeah. I
can't be other than myself. Yeah. I can't step out of this because I'm too,
right.
I'm like fear and trembling. I can't do it. I'm too terrified.
Yeah.
But I also just can't live inside of this anymore.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways that's really the crucible. Like, I think that the pincer of despair really kills people. And I think sometimes it literally kills people. When they're caught in that. Yeah. And so.
And that, just really, can you summarize that again? Like the despair, the thing.
The despair, which is being caught inside. Mm-hmm. Slowly asphyxiating inside of a container of persona that will not allow you to respire your own possibility, to aspire, I suppose, your own possibility, but also not having the courage to surrender yourself to the unknowable dimensions, the non-being of yourself that lies outside the boundary of that persona, which you must surrender yourself in that act of faith in order to become yourself outside the confines. But because that aspect the aspect of that unknowable dimension presents itself as darkness.
Yes.
It presents itself as horror.
Totally. And that's really interesting. I'm glad you presence that, because I think this is where the intent to be with what is, right, really comes into play.
Yeah.
Right? Like, because you meet these impasses, right? And everything in you wants to turn away. Everyone wants to turn away with it. Like, nothing's right. But then just to kind of like, it's this dimension of the unknown, right? That has a you could say has a despairing relationship to that unknown, because it's not known. It's you haven't come in to learn ignorance yet of it.
Yes.
But that impasse and that support to turn towards the thing that feels unbeatable with, right? Yes. Is in some sense, I think, is like the turning toward learned ignorance, because it's that very dimension, right, that feels like it's failed you, right?
Yes. And you need to be loved out of it.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
You need to be loved out of it.
Yeah.
Right? The thing that inspires the faith it takes to surrender to the dark.
Yeah.
That's your agape.
Yeah.
That's where the agape comes in. Totally. That's why the circular is needed.
Yeah.
Because you need the agape to you need the agape to create the courage to draw forth the act of faith.
Yeah.
Surrender yourself to the darkness of yourself.
Yeah.
And escape the confines of persona.
Right.
And that's such an act of courage, because for all intents and purposes, that move is death.
Yeah.
It is a movement into non-being.
Yeah.
A form of.
Yeah. Right. And that turning toward and confronting, and that agape, right, that helps afford that choice,
right,
and holding it there. It's like we're holding it there, and I think what's the transformation or the shift in relationship to that seems to be where Eros is awakened to that dimension, right?
Yeah.
Where the one can start to desire,
right,
that very darkness, right? It starts to become something that's actually in Eros. This is now, here's where Socrates, you really hear Socrates here, right?
Right. Because the light and the dark aspects actually reverse their orientation. John of the Cross talks about this, right? He says, like, to the soul in the dark, the light actually appears as darkness. Yeah. But the minute that you start to realize that, I know what I'm living is the darkness.
Yeah.
Beyond that, this is the cave again, right? Beyond, once I realize that the light I see is actually the darkness, it completely reverses the Socratic orientation.
Yeah.
That suddenly I become aware that what is beyond the boundaries of the light is actually the light. It's a bizarre paradox. It's a bizarre turn.
Yeah.
But it's like I have to suffer. It's like the suffering. There's a reason that the suffering is necessary before I'm ready to undertake that, because it's like I have to suffer myself to a point where I realize that reorientation becomes possible.
Yeah.
You know what this is reminding me of? This is okay. So this makes me realize this, like, one of the reasons why I think people come out of circling with this sense of transformation, just as they come out of Dialogos with this transformation, in part, I think, because all of this has a very mythic structure. Right? The cave, right? It has a mythic structure, which is that it's the cave structure, right? You wake up in the cave and you have to slowly be sensitized to living in that cave. And suddenly you have to realize that you're experiencing a kind of slow decay. There's a kind of a winnowing of yourself because of living within that persona.
Right.
And you're going to continue to winnow. It's like it goes back to Heraclitus again, right? If you don't change, we change regardless of whether we want to or not, right? And so if you don't advance, if you don't search out yourself, you will decay away from yourself. There is no option, right? You cannot remain the same. Either you will decay away from yourself, or in seeking yourself, you will come into it more and more in relation. But so one of the two will happen. You can't opt out of the change.
Yeah.
It's okay. So lately I've been really, this is interesting. I've been really obsessed. I've become, and I'm trying to figure out why I'm so obsessed, but I think it has something to do with this. I've become really obsessed with this story from a few years ago. You probably heard of it. It was like world famous. Remember back in 2018, there was the story of this soccer team in Thailand that got trapped inside of a cave. Do you remember that?
I think so. Yeah, I remember something about that.
Okay. It was this like world famous news story, and it kind of unfolded over a couple weeks. And then they were rescued. And it was like, oh, great, they're rescued. And then everyone just sort of continued about their business. And I remember being only peripherally aware of it at the time. Like the World Cup was going on and, we were all busy with our lives. So lately, I've taken an interest in this event because there's been a whole bunch of like documentary material and the feature. Like there's been all this, like a few years later, once the intellectual property rights and whatnot became available to the story, everyone's like producing narrative out of it. And a big part of feature of this story is the fact that they were rescued by a bunch of scuba cave divers. I just did some scuba certification a couple weeks ago, a few weeks back in September, and found it to be a tremendously existentially unnerving experience. And so I took an interest in the story because there was that dimension to it, having some idea of how difficult that actually is. And as I got to familiarize with the story, the mythic structure of this story became incredibly moving to me, because it's something like what we're describing, which is that this sort of the symbol of potential and innocence, which is this group of kids, basically, by force of nature, right? By force of the vicissitudes of existence itself, and a kind of feminine wrath, which is also kind of interesting. They get trapped by a flash flood deep inside this cavern, having gone into it just in a fit of play, right? Just after practice, they go into this cave and they're having fun and they're being jocular and all of that. There's a flash flood and they get trapped in this cave. They're all together. They get trapped and they try and find their way out. And in trying to find their way out, they end up going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And they end up at this point where they're basically flooded in. They're a few kilometers inside this cavern and they're trapped and nobody even knows where they are. And as time goes on, they just begin to dissolve toward death, right? They don't have any food. They have very little access to water. They have some water, but not much. They have very little light. They have no access to the outside world. They're just trapped inside darkness without food. And they just begin slowly, and they have this coach who's barely an adult himself, who uses, within the Buddhist tradition, uses a variety of practices like meditation and whatnot to keep their spirits alive and stoked so that they have some possibility of survival. People give them like 5 or 6 days max to survive. And they go 10 days without any contact with anyone outside, trapped inside this cave. 10 days, no food, no nothing, no like nothing. And somehow their spirits remain alive, but they're slowly starting to decay. And then they're found. They're found by cave divers who have eventually worked their way into this cavern. The problem is when the cave divers find them, they realize that there's like getting them out is basically impossible, because there's no access except through 3 kilometers worth of water, subterranean water. They can't get them out.
Whoa.
The only way they could get them out would be to dive them out, right? But the problem is that if you're not a very, very experienced, even if you are, but if you're not an experienced scuba diver, you hit a moment of panic and you're done, right? Panic is death. The entire exercise of doing that sport is an exercise of confronting existential terror, because it feels about as unnatural as anything could. And the minute you hit a moment's discomfort, your instincts basically rip off all the apparatus and shoot for the surface. But they're in a cave. There is no surface.
Yeah.
So they realized that they couldn't dive these kids out without the kids panicking, because they did try to do that with adults, and adults panic. They couldn't dive them out safely. There was just no chance of it. And even the most experienced cave divers in the world could barely make it through that channel. It's like, great, we found these kids, but like, what good is it that we found them? They're still just dying and we can't get them out. And so it's an incredible story, because you have these people that are flocking to Thailand from all over the world, trying to come up with a way of rescuing the symbol of innocence from inside of a cave.
Whoa.
And what it ends, Guy, it's fucking insane. I truly think it actually qualifies in the category of the miraculous, because of the number of synchronicities that actually have to happen in order for the way to become clear. And there's this whole backstory about the myth of this mountain under which they're trapped.
Yeah.
And the myth of a disaffected lover whose vengeance becomes these flash floods that traps this innocence, that then what has to rescue the innocence from the cave is an unconditional agapic love toward the value of their being for itself. Right?
Wow.
It's insane. And so, but the thing that turns the final thing that turns the story, because originally what they want to do is somehow just travel supplies in and out and keep them there for months until the water levels go down, like 5 or 6 months later. The problem is that even the process of getting supplies in is so treacherous that divers are absolutely and one did die in the course of trying to rescue them, that the divers would perish almost certainly over the course of time doing that. And also that the conditions of the cave itself were not conducive to remaining healthy. And so they know that the kids are gradually getting sick. And the oxygen, and this is what brought this all to mind in our conversation, is that the oxygen in the cave is gradually reducing and reducing.
Oh my God.
The floods are getting higher. The water level's getting higher. The rains are coming. The oxygen is decreasing, and they're getting sicker. And so basically, they realize, the people who are trying to rescue them realize we can't leave them in here. If they stay in here, we're leaving them to a slow death.
Yeah.
But the problem is, if we try and dive them out, they will almost certainly die.
Yeah.
It is an impossible either or. An impossible either or, right?
Yeah.
And they know that if they try and dive them out and they die, which they almost certainly will, their death, that the divers, the rescuers, will then be culpable for their death. But if they leave them to the cave, they will die and no one will be culpable except for nature herself.
Yeah.
And yet, that is not to the people who have assembled. They're so charged, they're so imbued with this absolute ferocious love, devotion to rescue these kids. And it's such a symbolic devotion, because who are these kids? They're nobody. It's an absolute symbol of potential and innocence and the good, right? Trapped inside of a cave. And so they make this impossible gambit which is that they anesthetize the kids in a cave and have to give them multiple doses of anesthesia underwater in a cave and dive them out in a 3-hour journey. There are 13 of them, and they do it, and it works, and everyone survives.
Holy shit.
It is basically, I think it's probably, now I've been basically gobbling up every bit of material about the story that I could find in the last 2 weeks, because to me, there is something about the structure of the way that because the whole story has this kind of spontaneous mythological structure, right? It's nature herself that traps these boys. There are 13 of them plus a coach, right? 12 of them plus a coach. So there's a strange number of them that is itself has a kind of religious overtone. And there's this strange interplay between the kind of the wrath of the feminine that traps the masculine, and then the masculine has to somehow espouse a kind of feminine agapic love in order to rescue the masculine from the feminine wrath, so there's this bizarre unity of opposites going on.
Yeah.
And it basically dramatizes and mythologizes this dynamic that you and I were just talking about, which is that if they were to remain in that cave, they would be out of immediate danger, but they would slowly decay. They would slowly asphyxiate. They would slowly just dissolve. They would be reduced to nothing, and they would die slowly and painfully and lose all vestige of spirit and sanity. In other words, they would completely succumb to their despair.
Yeah.
And diving them out of that cave risks certain or almost certain death.
Yeah.
And it is only the power of the faith of the agapic spirit that looks at that impossible dilemma and says, we're going to rescue them. Fuck it. We must.
Right.
And it works, which is like unreal.
Wow.
So to me, one of the things, you were very patient with me. Sorry for I had to just get all that. I had to get all that out, man. I had to get all that out. So when I think of the scaling of patterns, right? And I think there's something that's going on. Obviously, the stakes are radically different, but the fear and trembling for the prospect of surrendering oneself to the possibility of what is beyond the confines of the cave that we live in the guise of persona is analogous to the risk of death, to have to crawl through the channel of that cave in the arms of a rescuer who is determined to bear you to the light of determined to bear you to the self seen by the light of day.
Right.
And the courage, the existential courage required for that task is so interesting, because the person who is if we analogize the rescue diver to the circler for a moment, that circler, that rescue diver, there is also a great act of courage there too, because first of all, in the story, the rescue diver risks death himself, even as he tries to rescue. So there's that. But there's also the fact that if the rescue diver attempts to rescue one of these boys, and the boy dies in his arms, literally in his arms, as he's taking him through these caves, that diver is forever he's going to be living with that, right? Yeah. He's going to forever have failed this child, even if he knows rationally that the odds were always against it and it's almost certainly going to happen and it's not his fault, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. That child will still die in his arms.
Yeah.
And so there is an existential, the existential stakes of the mission are almost just as great as the physical stakes, right? You're risking your soul by undertaking this.
Wow.
Right? By helping to midwife someone back to life.
Yeah.
You are also risking your soul. You're staking your soul in the process.
Right. And
so there's courage on both sides.
Yeah.
And risk and fear and trembling on both sides.
And it's the agape. It's the evocation, the presence of agape that makes all of that configure as even a possibility to attempt, right?
Exactly, because it is possibility itself.
Yeah.
In that sense, agape becomes the possibility of the life of the person itself.
Yeah. Oh, this is so rich. This is so rich. Wow. This is so rich, Chris. I think what I want to do is I want to listen to this a number of times. I have to get ready for my course.
Yeah, and me too. So this is good, but
I do some diving this weekend. So, but this
I got a chill actually when I one of the, because the last circling weekend, even though I was very late coming to it, I had forgotten that there was a module called the deep diver, and I got a chill.
Yeah.
I got a chill down my spine when I remembered that. Yeah, by the way,
totally,
for all of these reasons.
Yeah. Much love, my friend.
Much love to you.
All right. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
You bet.